Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Welcome, everyone, to the People's Forum. My name is Leanne, and I am so thrilled to see such a packed house, and the line is continuing out the door And also so thrilled to know that we are joined by so many of you online all across the country and all around the world. But let me just ask the room here in New York, raise your hand if this is your first time at the People's Forum. Wow, amazing. I want to extend an especially warm welcome to all of you, and all of you who may be joining us online for the first time as well. Just for everyone here in the room, the People's Forum is a political education and cultural center. We host many courses, we have concerts, we host organizations, we have meetings, public meetings. But more importantly, we are a political home, a home for the people, a home for all people who are in struggle for a better world. And in particular, we are a home for all of those who want to study, who want to learn, who want to teach, who want to discuss, exchange the histories, the realities, the ideas of our people and our truths and our realities all across the world. And so we are more than thrilled for the opportunity to be hosting Professor Rashid Khalidi, who is the Edward Said Professor Emeritus of Arab Studies at Columbia University, the author of many very important books for understanding the realities of endless wars across the Middle East and Arab region. And I'm sure you all know Professor Khaledi was supposed to be teaching a course on modern Middle Eastern history at Columbia University this fall, but because Columbia University decided to capitulate to the Trump administration and sacrifice the principles of academic freedom, Professor Khaledi chose to withdraw his course and instead teach a course here at the People's Forum that would be accessible to the wider public. And I'll let him tell you more about that, of course, but what I just want to point out, and that is very important to all of us here at the People's Forum, is that while those 300 students who are enrolled at Columbia University now are not able to take that class on Columbia University's campus, I do hope that they are all registered and taking the course here at the People's Forum, and I just really want to note that as of now, over 4,500 people are registered in this course. We are also live streaming, and this will be reaching many tens of thousands of more viewers across the world, and this is really important. Because, and I hope for all of us that we can agree, this is a cause for celebration, because it's a clear message that for all those who try to erase the Palestinian reality, the Palestinian struggle and Palestinian history from our classrooms, from our campuses, from our universities, well, they will not succeed. And they will not succeed because the people inside and outside the universities insist that the Palestinian movement is not only something that we are going to preserve, but something that we're going to grow. So we are so grateful that Professor Khaledi can be joining us for this course. I want to go over just a few logistics before we welcome him onto the stage. So if you have already registered for the course, you should have received an email that would give you access to a student portal where you can find the syllabus and the readings. Most of the readings are downloadable, but there are also some course books. The books are available here at the People's Forum, but also at 1804 Books here, the bookstore in the front, or online at 1804books.com. The books for sale for this course, all the proceeds are going to the fundraiser for this course, which will support the reconstruction of Gaza's universities. And I also just want to make one more logistical note. We are a very large class, as you can see all around you, but also everyone joining us online. We will have some time for question and answer. But when we do get to that time, we're only going to be able to take live questions from the people who are here in the room. And even so, we may certainly not get to everyone. So please be patient with us. If we don't get to your question, whether you're here in New York City or you are watching us online, please write down your question, save the question, and email it to us at education@peoplesforum.org. We, of course, may not be able to respond individually to everyone, but this will help us understand what we need to address in other spaces and in future classes. So, with that, welcome again, and please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Professor Khaledi.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you all for being here. Thanks to Columbia, I'm addressing 10 times as many people as I would have if I were giving the course on campus. Leanne explained to you the genesis of this event, and it's not something that I planned. As of this summer, I was planning to teach the course. There were almost 300 students enrolled. And when Columbia, as she mentioned, capitulated to the Trump administration and specifically accepted a number of conditions which I felt made it impossible for me to teach the course as I had planned it, insofar as the section on Palestine was concerned and insofar as other sections of the course were concerned. I wrote a letter to the president, which you can read in the Guardian newspaper, in which I told her I was not going to teach the course because of the specific reasons I laid out there. If you really want to know more about it, you can look at that article in The Guardian. I want to thank the People's Forum, because what they've enabled me to do, because of this completely unexpected event in the summer, is in record time put together an event with over 4,000 people. I've not often addressed audiences that large, and that's really thanks to the enormous effort of a wonderful team here who've done an extraordinary job. They have put together, in a fashion I have never experienced in dealing with 5 different universities, a course packet. So the massive, heavily endowed Ivy League and other universities I've taught at were incapable of putting together a course packet in anything like the speed of this very small group of dedicated people. So give it up for them. Okay, I want to once more apologize to the students who were signed up for the course. I've run into a number of them on campus and off campus, and all of them said, "Oh, I'm so sorry I couldn't take your course." Most of them said, "You did the right thing," and most of them said, "And I'm going to try and take the course online." I hope you're taking it online. It only covers a part of what you would have gotten in the Modern Middle East History course, but if you want, I can mail you, to any student who missed out on it, I can mail you the syllabus and you can do the reading on your own. I want to remind you of something that Leanne said, which is that all of the book sales for the only 3, I think, books that we will be selling up front, all of the money from the book sales will go to the ISNAD Foundation, which is a 501c3, which supports the 3 major universities in Gaza. It pays the salaries of faculty who, to this day, are teaching, and pays each student who is still able to study. So they've raised $6 million so far. They have a target of $16 million. The book sales and any contributions you choose to make, there's a QR code on the online course schedule where you can contribute, and I hope you will contribute. This is a free course. The idea is, education for the people, free, but if any of you feel it in your hearts to support universities, which not one American university has said one word about. 12 universities destroyed. Not one American university has uttered a single word about it. So you can partly make up for that by your contributions if you choose to do that. And if you buy the books, you'll be making a contribution. Okay, let me talk about how this is going to go. We're going to have 5 sessions together. Each of them will run about 2 hours, if I hold up for 2 hours. I'll lecture for the first hour and a bit, hour and 15, hour and 20 minutes. We will take questions. People will roam around with mics in the room here. and I'll try and leave at least 15 or 20 minutes at the end for questions. As Leanne said, there's a huge number of you in here. I'm sure that not everybody's question will be answered. It will be made easier if you ask questions rather than making speeches. If you have deep points of interest that you'd like to take up with me, you can come at me afterwards and we can talk about those things. But if you have questions, I welcome them, any questions. There's one exception, which is that I want you to hold your questions for the end, with the exception of any word or any name or any place that I mentioned that you didn't get. In that case, wave your hand, stop me, and say, just repeat that name or repeat that place. So maybe Balfour, you know his name, but you might not know some of the other names that I mentioned or some of the other places. I'll try not to do too much of that. I'll try not to talk too fast. I was born in the city. I walk fast, I talk fast. I can't help it, but I'll try and slow down a little bit. But if I do go too fast, stop me and make me repeat anything that you may have missed. The last element of organization has to do with the readings. The readings are completely voluntary. There are no tests. I don't care if you do the reading. I hope you do, some of it at least. It's divided into 3 sections. The assigned readings are very closely linked to what I'll be talking about each week. You can read them before, during, after, or not at all. And then there are additional readings of 2 kinds. One set are available online to everybody who's registered. And at your leisure, you can read the articles or the pages of the books that the staff have put up for you online. Everybody who's registered will have access to those. And that's if you want to go deeper. Finally, there are a few suggested books, which you can go out and buy if you want to. But again, this is only for those who have a deep interest in a specific aspect of something I'm talking about. So what I'm going to try and do in this course is to encompass the entire modern history of Palestine in 5 sessions. That's a very daunting task. There are books and books and books and books on it. I could have had 50 hours to talk about it, and I wouldn't have really been able to fully cover the topic. It means that I'll have to skip a great deal. It means I have had to make difficult choices about what to include and what to skip. So some of your favorite bits and pieces, especially if you've studied this topic in the past or if you yourself are Palestinian, some of the bits and pieces that are most dear to you, I may not focus on, and I apologize in advance. But I've had to make some very tough choices. What I have chosen to focus on are elements of this conflict over Palestine that we're all suffering through these days with the martyrdom of Gaza, as that has developed over a little more than a century. I will be talking a little bit about social and economic history, but it won't be my focus. There's a bibliography which you can have access to, 40, 50 pages. It's a Word document. If you're interested in economic or social, just type in, you can search it and find all the books on economic history or all the books on social history. But that will not be my focus in this 5-lecture series. I will bring in elements of it when it's necessary. I'll also bring in elements of international relations, especially regarding Great Britain and the United States, which are major actors, obviously, in this drama, wherever they relate to Palestine. And as you're going to see, they relate quite extensively to Palestine in many eras of this last century or so. Inevitably, I'm going to be bringing in elements relating to Zionism and to Israel, but neither social and economic history, nor the great powers, nor the histories of Israel and Zionism are the focus of this course. This course will focus on an understudied and underappreciated perspective on Palestine. And that is a perspective which centers the Palestinians themselves and how the events that we're going to be discussing affected the Palestinians. Many of these events had effects all over the world. Many of them had effects on other Arab countries. I'm not going to be talking about that. In the main, I'll try and talk about how what I'll be focusing on over these 5 sessions affected the Palestinians, how they saw these things. I don't think that's well enough understood, and that's why I'm taking this focus. So let me start by talking about starting points. Where do you start talking about the modern history of Palestine? Historians are obsessed with starting points. It's one of their favorite little games. No, the Middle Ages started, or no, the French Revolution really started. No. There are many ways to narrate the history of Palestine and the conflict that we'll be talking about, and there are many possible starting points I could choose. Several of them are false starting points. One of the false starting points is to go back to biblical times, or before biblical times. We have to talk about the Jebusites, the Canaanites. No, we actually don't. Nor do we have to talk about the Bible, nor do we have to talk about early Islamic history. There is a history of Palestine that encompasses those things. But the modern history of Palestine, except in one respect that I'll talk about in a minute, should not start in any of those ancient starting points. Both Palestinians and Israelis, of course, and their history have a great deal, have an enormous relationship to those earlier eras. But in fact, those starting points have little or nothing to do with the actual history of the past century or two, except, and this is the caveat, except in the self-perception of some of the protagonists. In other words, they see themselves reenacting their version of this ancient history. So you have Israelis saying, we are at Masada, this is this, or others say, Salah ad-Din is today. No. This is a self-perception which is important to understanding Palestinians or Israelis or others, but it's not actually what is happening. History is not repeating itself. This ancient history is relevant to the self-perception of people, but that's not where you start what's happening in Palestine today, I would argue. There are more relevant starting points, which I also will not use, but I'm going to give a couple of them. One of them would be to look at something that seems to be far away and distant from Palestine, but it's extremely important. And this is the Great Revival, the so-called Great Religious Revival, that took place in Protestant countries in the early 19th century. It witnessed a whole new reading of the Bible. It witnessed a fascination with what came to be seen as a Christian obligation to return the Jews to the Holy Land. This is something that gripped the entire British aristocracy and large groups of other Protestants in Northern Europe and in North America. It's very, very important to understanding Britain's interests in the Middle East and the interests of other countries with large Protestant populations. If you want to understand the roots of evangelical Christian Zionism today in the United States, you have to go back to the Great Revival, which is where a completely new reading of the Bible started, which saw, as I've said, the return of the Jews to the Holy Land as a Christian duty, something that we see in modern American society today. Now, this wasn't just a religious revival. This is a revival that had a powerful impact on policy. I'm not going to go into the details because it's not entirely germane, but you had major politicians, British aristocrats like Lord Shaftesbury, like Lord Palmerston, who were motivated by these ideas and whose actions were enormously important in establishing Britain's position in Palestine. Both Shaftesbury, one of the most influential statesmen of the 19th century, and Palmerston, who was prime minister several times in the 19th century, play a big role in bringing Britain into Palestine, as it were. Initially through things like archaeology and Bible study and searching for biblical roots, but also through mapping, intelligence, establishing consulates, expanding influence, developing relationships with local communities that could be tools for British influence. And this is the beginning of real British involvement in Palestine in the middle and late 19th century, and it's rooted in this Christian Zionism, which emerged from this great revival of the 19th century. All of this, incidentally, antedated modern political Zionism by several decades. In other words, you have Christian Zionism in the 1820s and 30s and 40s. Modern political Zionism starts in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s. Decades before this became a movement among Jews, it was a movement among Christian Protestants, especially in Great Britain, but also in other Protestant countries. So that's one possible starting point. I'm not going to start there. I just wanted to mention that. I have another false starting point, but which is also germane, as I think what I just talked about was. And this starting point would be the rise of modern political Zionism in the late 19th century, culminating in the first political settlements, politically motivated agricultural settlements in the 1780s, 1870s and late 1870s and early 1880s, and then crowned by the organization of the first Zionist Congress in Basel in Switzerland in 1897, all of this following on the publication of Theodor Herzl's famous book, Der Judenstaat, The State of the Jews, or the Jewish State. And that's a possible starting point. Before modern political Zionism, you certainly have no roots of a conflict such as we've seen today. There's a monstrously false narrative, which the president, among other ignoramuses, propounds night and day, that this has been going on for 2,000 years. No, there never was any conflict of this sort between Jews and Arabs or Muslims in Palestine ever before the late 19th century. Ever. There are many conflicts between European powers, local powers, going back to the Hittites, going back to the Egyptians, going back to as far as you want to go back, Alexander the Great, the Romans, and so on and so forth. But none of the protagonists in the conflict that we've seen for the last century has anything to do with anything that happened before the late 19th century. Nothing, nada, zip, zilch. Completely false narrative. It has not been going on since time immemorial. It has not been going on for 2,000 years. It starts with any of the seeds that I mentioned, and the most important of them I'm going to come to in a minute. Another possible starting point, which again I'm not going to take, is the rise of Palestinian national consciousness in the late 19th century, especially and running into the early 20th century. I could talk about that. I wrote a whole book about it called Palestinian Identity. It's one of the suggested readings. If you really are interested in how Palestinian nationalism develops, you can look at that. If you're interested in Zionism, Arthur Hertzberg's The Zionist Idea will give you both a brilliant introduction and enormous number of texts by early Zionist writers, the earliest of which, by the way, are in the 1860s and 70s. Modern political Zionism is a modern national movement, has nothing to do with anything before that. It's a completely new idea, and Hertzberg makes that perfectly clear. But I don't think any of those are the starting point for this conflict in the configuration, which it has had for over a century. I think rather that it's important to emphasize a completely different starting point. And this is the issuance by the British cabinet of what came to be known as the Balfour Declaration. Balfour Declaration was a simple letter issued over the signature of Lord Balfour. I'm going to read the text of it to you in a minute, in which Britain offered its support for what was called a Jewish national home in Palestine. I'm going to read you the text in a second. This declaration didn't come in a void. It came literally 8 days after British troops conquered Jerusalem in 1917, okay? And so we have a declaration which is not just pious words in the sky. This is a declaration on behalf of the cabinet of the greatest empire in world history up till that point, whose troops had just conquered Jerusalem and the southern part of Palestine, and in the following months were to conquer the rest of Palestine. So it was a declaration of enormous consequence, because it was made by the conquerors of Jerusalem and of Palestine, who were not just some, third-rate minor power. This was the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland at the time, so-called, which was, as I've said, the greatest empire the world had seen up to that point. So it is important. And I would argue that it marks the beginning of the configuration of this conflict as it has endured down to this day. That's why I start this course with this date and with this document. This is a conflict that's been driven by powerful outside forces, acting in their own interests as they see them, and operating in support of one side exclusively in a struggle between Zionism and the indigenous inhabitants of Palestine. That's the configuration of the conflict. Before the Balfour Declaration, you had Zionism, and you had an indigenous population that was beginning to resist. But the conflict took on the specific configuration it has always had for every instant since then with the Balfour Declaration, which is why it is so important and why I'm going to read it to you. Now, a number of the documents that I'll be reading to you are available online, easily accessible, for you to peruse at your leisure. If any of you bring a laptop with you, to, I'm not suggesting you should, but if you do, or have another device that is capable of doing this, you can look at these documents as I'm reading them to you. Not all the documents I'll cite are on the website, but many of them are, and this one is. So the document was dated November 2nd. By November 9th, the British were in control of Jerusalem. November 2nd, 1917. It's addressed to Lord Rothschild, who was the envoy of the Zionist movement in Great Britain. And Balfour says, I have much pleasure in conveying to you on behalf of His Majesty's government the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionists' aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the cabinet. And this is the declaration. His Majesty's government, it's one sentence. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, comma, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, at which time existing non-Jewish communities were 96% or 94% of the population, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. Then there's a concluding sentence. I should be grateful if you bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation. Yours, Arthur James Balfour. Now, Lord Balfour, I later found out, had a storied history as an imperialist. He's not only the person who, as much as anybody, was responsible for Britain's adoption of this declaration and of its support for Zionism. He had a long and storied career in other parts of the empire. He served as the chief secretary in Dublin, meaning he was the senior British official. Unlike every other part of the United Kingdom, an official appointed from London actually ran the country, okay? Anywhere else, acts of parliament determined what happened. And that took place in a fashion where there was no viceroy, there was no executor for London. But Ireland was different. Ireland was actually a conquered country, even though it was nominally part of the United Kingdom, even though its population by this stage voted. And Balfour was the chief secretary for several years. His brother was then chief secretary for several other years. At that time, his uncle, Lord Salisbury, was the prime minister, which is how he got the job at 29, senior cabinet position. And he became much hated by the Irish people for his repressive policies, to the point that at a conference on Irish studies one day, when I gave a talk about Balfour and Palestine, I got an enthusiastic reception. And I said to my hosts, I didn't know that people in Irish studies were so interested in Palestine. I said, no, not Palestine. It's bloody Balfour. That's what we call him. Because, and then the guy gave me a litany of what Balfour had done in Ireland. I said, I see why you don't like the fellow. So this was Balfour. Now, the importance of this declaration lies in two regards. The first and the most obvious is it put the world's greatest empire behind the Zionist project for several crucial decades. The second is several items in the wording, which I'm going to go back over and mention to you. It does not talk about a Jewish state in Palestine. The objective of the Zionist movement was a Jewish state, a state over which the Jewish people would have sovereignty. If you read Herzl's diaries, if you read his books, they're short books. If you read the proceedings of the Zionist congresses, the first several Zionist congresses, they were not talking about living as a protected minority in somebody else's country. They were talking about a sovereign Jewish state with a Jewish majority. Now, the Balfour Declaration doesn't say that. It says the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. What does that mean? Not clear. Is that intentional? Obviously. The British had other concerns. They were worried about Arab sentiment. They were worried about other Allied powers. It was the middle of World War I. They had a variety of concerns. So in typical devious, ambiguous fashion, the language here is unclear, was meant to be unclear. Now, Chaim Weizmann, the leader of the Zionist movement after Theodor Herzl, at a dinner party, I think at Balfour's home, was told by Balfour and Churchill and Lloyd George, the three top people in the British government, of course what we mean is a Jewish state, but we couldn't say that. So this ambiguous wording is important. What the British meant and what the Zionists meant was one thing. What the Balfour Declaration said was another thing. It might or might not have encompassed what Herzl Weizmann, Lloyd George, Balfour, Churchill actually intended. But that's not what the wording said. The second part of this declaration I want to go over is the clause which says, nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. Now, first of all, I've already mentioned the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine were 94% or so of the population of the country. They're never mentioned in the Balfour Declaration by name. There is a national home for a Jewish people, but there's no mention of another people or of national rights or of a national home in Palestine for anybody else. All that is mentioned is not political, not national, but civil and religious rights. In other words, your right to property, your right to bring suit, your right to worship is protected under this declaration. Your right to vote, your right to be sovereign is not mentioned, not for the non-Jewish communities. National home implies political and national rights. This term excludes political and national rights. And this declaration is to be the basis of the League of Nations mandate for Palestine. So what Britain then carried out in Palestine was determined by these ambiguous, shifty, devious, typically British imperial words. Okay, what this means is that, as I've said, you have the greatest empire of its day, perhaps the greatest empire in world history, supporting this project. Now, some people have said, oh, the British did this because of philo-Semitism or Christian Zionism or some positive orientation towards Jewish people or towards the Zionist project. I actually don't think that's true. A number of the people in the cabinet were themselves anti-Semites. They could not have been philo-Semites. A number of the people in the cabinet were Christian Zionists, were deeply obsessed with the idea of the return of the Jews to Palestine. But this is a cabinet which included people who a few years earlier, 12 years earlier, had passed something called the Alien Act, the Alien Exclusion Act it's sometimes called, which excluded Jewish refugees from pogroms in Eastern Europe from coming to England. So these were not people who were worried about the persecution of Jews per se. Or if they were, they had explicitly prevented those poor refugees from pogroms in Kishinev and so on and so forth in the 1890s and the early 19th century and early 20th century from coming to Britain. I would argue, and I think most historians would agree, that Britain's motivations for the Balfour Declaration were strategic in essence. Britain was obsessed for at least 10 years, probably 15 years, before the Balfour Declaration with the vulnerability of Egypt to attack from the east by the Ottoman Empire or by Ottoman allies like Germany. And in fact, that fear came true during World War I when Ottoman forces attacked Egypt from the east, crossed the Sinai Peninsula, arrived at the Suez Canal, closed the Suez Canal, and caused enormous problems for the British Empire for over a year. In fact, almost 2 years. So that was a defensive strategic obsession that the British had long before Balfour became a Zionist, long before he had even met Chaim Weizmann, before, in fact, any of these things that we're talking about were in anybody's mind. This was a strategic consideration that was uppermost in the minds of British imperial strategists. A second consideration was that Palestine constituted the shortest terminus on the Mediterranean for a land route between the Mediterranean and the Gulf. In fact, later on, a railway was planned between Haifa and Basra, never built. Roads were built, pipeline was built, and air bases were built along that route. So Britain wanted to control the shortest land route between the Gulf and the Mediterranean. Why? Because of its Indian Empire. It controlled the Suez Canal. It wanted to defend Egypt, where the Suez Canal was located, and it wanted to also control the shortest land route between the Mediterranean and the Gulf. And if you look at the map of the Middle East today, you see these strange arms sticking out from Iraq and Jordan. Why are those strange arms there? Why are these straight lines across the desert which link Jordan and Iraq? That's the shortest land route between the Mediterranean and the Gulf, which was under British control as a result of Britain's actions before, during, and after World War I. So this is why they wanted Palestine. It had a good port, which was the major terminus, the best terminus of the shortest land route, and it thereby connected British interests in the Mediterranean with British interests in the Gulf. That's why the British issued the Balfour Declaration, in my view, and in the view, I think, of the better historians. There are some who don't agree, but leave them aside. What this meant was the beginning of support over the next century by Western powers, starting with Britain, for the Zionist project against the indigenous population. We're going to see that even Balfour eventually realizes this. What this means, the fact that this project, since its inception, or very soon after its inception, has enjoyed the support of these great powers, Western powers, means that this has never been an equal contest. You are told in the sludge that passes for the mass media that there's huge numbers of Arabs and Muslims in Israel. It's this tiny little itty-bitty state. Yes, Israel is a very small state, small population, many Arab countries. But into that equation has always entered the big, fat, greasy thumb of the great powers, pushing the scale way down in one direction, on one side. That is what the Balfour Declaration initiates. That everlasting, unending, continuous support mouthed only yesterday by the president, side by side with his buddy, Netanyahu. Now, Palestinians had been aware of the Zionist project from very early on. When you look at the 100 Years' War, you'll see a letter written by one of my ancestors to Theodor Herzl over 125 years ago, in which he lays out the concerns of what obviously was more than just that individual. He's a man who had been mayor of Jerusalem. He'd been deputy for Jerusalem in the Ottoman parliament. He had been a diplomat abroad. He'd studied and taught in Vienna. He knew about these things, and he represented somebody, at least. He'd been elected to parliament. He'd been mayor of Jerusalem. And so he was one of many people who were concerned about this. They saw this project as threatening to create a Jewish state in an overwhelmingly Arab country. And you can read his letter to Herzl, and you can read about Herzl's reply if you're interested. The point is that there had been this concern on the part of Palestinians already for many years, starting with agrarian unrest by peasants who had been pushed off their lands, by sales to Zionist purchasing agencies, by absentee landlords. That had started in the 1880s and 90s. You had later on urban friction. You had later, even after that, once the press was freed by the Ottoman Revolution of 1908, a vast outpouring of articles. I found 300 or 400 articles in newspapers in Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, and one in Istanbul, Arabic newspapers, talking about Zionism, worried about Zionism, concerned about Zionism. There were speeches by deputies from Damascus, from Jerusalem, from other parts of the Ottoman Empire about Zionism, saying this is a project that has dangers for the Ottoman Empire, has dangers for Palestine. So there was a concern about Zionism among, at the very least, a segment, a level, a stratum of Palestinian society. Certainly literate, educated people were certainly concerned about this. We just read the papers and you can see the extent to which there was concern about this. I wrote a long article about this decades ago. Now, at this stage, talking about the early 20th century, Palestinians had already come to be affected by ideas of nationalism, the idea that you had to live in a sovereign nation state, that you should have the same language, the same identity, that you live within defined frontiers, starting in the late 19th century, but really developing in the early 20th century. And this is almost identical to the development of nationalism in other Arab and African, Middle Eastern, Asian countries. Also in the Balkans, Southern Europe, and Eastern Europe, nationalism is developing in the late 19th century, the early 20th century. Even in Western Europe, it actually doesn't develop that much earlier. So nationalism is a very modern phenomenon. Every national movement claims ancient origins. You know, you poor little French children used to read in their history books, the first page, nos ancêtres les Gaulois, our ancestors the Gauls. Well, actually, the Gauls weren't the ancestors of the French. They were a German-speaking tribe, nothing to do with France, French, whatever. But that's what they were taught. So the history of France starts with the Gauls, which means 2,000 years ago. If you poor little Israeli children are taught something quite similar, little American children are taught something different. No Gauls for them. A lot of Bible these days, though. The point here is that you already had the beginnings of a national consciousness in the early 20th century, all over this region. And it's more or less developing at the same time as Zionism, ironically. And at this stage, it's mainly an elite phenomenon. It's not yet a mass phenomenon, as was at that stage Zionism. And as I said, if you're interested in this, the book Palestinian Identity is right there. Now, something terrible had happened in this part of the world during World War I. The Ottoman Empire entered the war on the side of Germany and Austria and suffered enormously. It won some victories, it lost enormously. The Ottoman government carried an atrocious massacre, the Armenian genocide, in the middle of the war. And the Ottoman army suffered enormous losses. The Ottoman Empire actually had the heaviest losses of any World War I combatant, most of whom were civilians. If you look at it as a proportion of total population, more people in the Ottoman Empire died during World War I, whether during the Armenian genocide or as a result of famine or as a result of combat wounds than any other combatant power. The next closest is Serbia and then Russia, but way, way lower. And the civilian toll was enormous in the Ottoman Empire. Everybody was drafted. All draft animals were seized by the army. So if you had a mule or a camel or a donkey or a horse, they took it away. And your ability to farm, your ability to do anything, move crops to market, disappeared. You could carry them on your back, and that was it. And all the men were gone. During World War I, all 4 of my adult uncles were drafted into the Ottoman army, and all of them served, and 2 of them were wounded. And that was typical of every family throughout the Ottoman Empire. So you had an enormous impact of the war on the Ottoman Empire, and therefore on Palestine, which at this point was part of the Ottoman Empire. People were, I would say the society was traumatized by the impact of World War I in a variety of ways. They learned about the Balfour Declaration much, much later than its issuance because of British censorship. The British imposed a military occupation on Palestine for the first several years before they brought in a British civil administration, and they wouldn't let anybody publish anything for years after they occupied Palestine in 1917. I think the first newspaper opened again in 1919 or 1920, 3 years after they took Palestine. But they heard about it, and they immediately began to oppose this idea. They said, how are you going to establish a Jewish national home with what the British were already saying would be unlimited immigration in a country that already has a population and already has a national nature? We are people were saying. And you could read this as soon as the papers started to come out. You could read this in the press in the 1920s. They organized a variety of congresses, Muslim Christian congresses, one after another, passed resolutions, elected deputies, sent them delegations to London. The British ignored them, refused to talk to them. Or if they talked to them, they said, we will only speak to you if you accept the terms of the Balfour Declaration. And the Palestinians would say, the Balfour Declaration doesn't relate to us. It doesn't give us political or national rights. And the British say, well, you have to accept the terms of the Balfour Declaration. And after the mandate had been adopted by the League of Nations in 1922, the British said, you have to accept the terms of the mandate. And I'm going to talk about the terms of the mandate in a minute. But that incorporated the Balfour Declaration and implemented it in a variety of ways which were uniquely and entirely favorable to the Zionist project and said nothing about the Palestinians. Like the Balfour Declaration, the League of Nations mandate for Palestine does not say one word about Palestinians or Arabs. The word Palestinian and Arab is not in the mandate. There are 7 of its 28 articles which relate specifically to supporting, enhancing, developing the Zionist project. Nothing about the indigenous population of Palestine. It was a typical imperial document, in other words. And the Palestinians would say, but we can't accept the mandate. The mandate negates our very existence. We don't exist in the mandate. If we accept the mandate, we don't exist. Why are you even talking to us? Well, we want you to accept the terms of the mandate. We want you to accept the Jewish national home in your country with all of these advantages, which I'll talk about in a minute, that are listed in the mandate. And of course, the Palestinians refused, and the British, therefore, ignored them. Now, the League of Nations mandate was not the only element which showed how biased the British were in Palestine. Even before the mandate had been adopted by the League of Nations in 1922, the British appointed a leading British Zionist aristocrat, Sir Herbert Samuel, later Lord Samuel, as the first High Commissioner. And he set the tone for the mandatory administration. He's the man who really laid the foundations, not just for the way the British ruled Palestine, but for the Israel that was to come. Because that was what the mandate was intended to do. That's what, when they met at dinner, Balfour and Lloyd George and who was the third, Churchill, said to Chaim Weizmann, yes, of course we're going to establish a Jewish state. That's what the mandate is for. And that was what Sir Herbert Samuel, later Lord Samuel, was there to do. Now, the covenant has a number of, the mandate has a number of provisions. I'm actually not going to read them. They're too cumbersome. But I will talk about them in a minute. The important thing about the terms of the mandate, if you look at it quite carefully, is that it's completely at odds with the supposed basis for the whole mandate system as laid down in the covenant of the League of Nations. The whole mandate system was supposed to have a certain set of outcomes, self-determination being the most important of them. The mandate explicitly excludes Palestinian self-determination. It doesn't even talk about the Palestinians. And so the Palestinians would keep going back to the British and saying, the whole mandate system is based in Article 22 on recognizing our existence as independent nations. The language says, certain communities have reached a stage of development where their existence is Article 22 of the Covenant of the League of Nations. Certain communities have reached a stage of development where their existence as independent nations can be provisionally recognized subject to the rendering of assistance by a mandatory. The wishes of these communities must be a principal consideration in the selection of the mandatory. The Palestinians said, A, you're not giving us recognition as an independent nation. You're saying there's another nation here, but not us. We're the majority. B, you never asked us whether we wanted you as a mandatory. We don't. We'd rather have the Americans. We don't have anybody else than you. The British ignore this. So the covenant, which again, it's another document that you can find online if you're interested, was constantly cited by the Palestinians as something that was completely contradicted by the terms of the mandate itself. Now, the British, in fact, were only pretending to be stupid. They were not stupid. They understood perfectly well what they were doing. In fact, Balfour himself wrote in a confidential memo, which he sent to Lord Curzon and to the cabinet in 1919, the following. And I'm going to read this to you. This is another document which you can read online if you're interested. So he said the following. The contradiction between the letter of the covenant, what I've just told you about, and the policy of the Allies is even more flagrant in the case of the, scare quotes, independent nation of Palestine than in that of the independent nation of Syria. For in Palestine, he admits, we do not propose even to go through the form of consulting the wishes of the present inhabitants of the country. If this reminds you of what President Trump said yesterday, there is a similarity. Nothing has changed since 1919 and 2025. He went on. The four great powers are committed to Zionism. And Zionism, be it right or wrong, good or bad, is rooted in age-long traditions, in present needs, he was a great writer, in future hopes of far profounder import than the desires and prejudices of the 700,000 Arabs who now inhabit that ancient land. There's all kinds of prejudice buried within those words, but what he's basically saying is, whether they want it or not, we're supporting Zionism, and we don't really care what the majority thinks. In my opinion, that is right. This is Balfour again. What I've never been able to understand is how it can be harmonized with the declaration, a declaration that the British had made to Arab leaders, the covenant, or the instructions to the Anglo-American Commission of Inquiry, which found out that the Palestinians did not want a British mandate. he concluded, "I do not think that Zionism will hurt the Arabs, but they will never say they want it." That was true. Whatever be the future of Palestine, it is not now an independent nation, nor is, again in scare quotes, nor is it yet on the way to become one. Whatever deference should be paid to the views of those who live there, the powers in their selection of a mandatory do not propose, as I understand the matter, to consult them. In short, so far as Palestine is concerned, the powers have made no statement of fact, which is not admittedly wrong, and no declaration of policy, which, at least in the letter, they have not always intended to violate. So here you have somebody saying, we are liars, we are hypocrites, and we don't care. Meaning, whatever you might say about him, in one respect at least, an honest man. Now, that document was buried in the British archives from 1919 until its publication in 1954. Nobody even knew this document existed until the early 50s. Now, I'm not going to read you the Mandate for Palestine, it's much too long, but all of its most important articles, 7 of the 28, concern the obligations of Britain to further the objectives of the Zionist movement. Unlimited immigration, land purchase, close settlement of the Jews on the land. In other words, a legal system for land which facilitates the transfer of land from its Arab owners to new Jewish owners. Citizenship for any immigrant. Control by each community of its institutions, which meant control not by religious instances in the case of the Jewish community in Palestine, but rather control by the Jewish Agency, which is a body established by the Mandate as a representative, recognized, quote, unquote, public body with diplomatic standing in Geneva to run the affairs of the Jewish community in Palestine, including, this is a Zionist institution, including running the affairs of the very large number of non-Zionist religious Jews who lived there. The British basically, through the Mandate, gave all of this power to this newly established Jewish agency, including control over education, including control over many other things, such as self-defense. So what the British essentially did was to create the embryo of an independent government within a government. You had the British mandatory government run entirely by Brits. There were no Arabs and no indigenous Jewish Palestinians within the top ranks of the mandatory administration. There were some British Jews, Zionists, people like Lord Bentwich and Sir Herbert Samuel. But nobody from Palestine was in the top ranks of this administration. They worked in the lower ranks. This was a British administration. But under it, there was a Jewish agency which controlled many, many aspects of life and was, in effect, a government within a government. When Israel becomes independent in 1948, they don't create new ministries. The political department becomes the foreign ministry. The one agency becomes another ministry, and so on and so forth. All of these things had been created by the Mandate as in effect, a government within a government. By contrast, the Palestinians, never mentioned in the Mandate, never were granted the self-governing institutions that are promised in Article 2 of the Mandate. Guess who was granted those institutions? The Jewish community. They were allowed to elect an assembly. That assembly then chose members of the Jewish agency. And so you had all of the institutions of a state even before, decades before the state was actually established. The British continued to protect and to foster this project in spite of mounting Palestinian opposition and growing resistance. You had uprisings in 1920, 1921, and a big one in 1929. Eventually, this led to a major uprising in 1936, 1939 that I'll talk about at the end of today's talk. Now, that's all I have to say for the moment about the British. I could say much more. I'll talk a little bit about the role of the British in suppressing the 36-39 revolt. But I want to go over and talk about the nature of the Zionist project on the ground. Because if you go back and you read what was being said in Basel at the First Zionist Congress, or you go back and you read Herzl's writings, one thing that's not entirely clear is how they intend to deal with the indigenous population of this country that they want to take over. And make no mistake, they intend to take it over. Herzl does not write a book saying, the Jewish and something else state. He writes a book saying, the Jewish state. He talks about sovereignty for the Jewish people. So that was the intention. What do you do with this 700,000 people who are not Jews and who have a developing national consciousness? Now, this is one of the great ironies of Zionism. It's an attempt to deal with European prejudice, essentially. It's an attempt to build on a connection, a Jewish religious connection, to the land of Israel, to Palestine. It's an attempt to establish a national movement, a national project which treats the Jews as a modern people with national rights like everybody else was claiming in the 19th century. And it is based on a myth that the longing for Zion, which is part of Judaism, which is intrinsic to Judaism, is the same, and this is a long-standing longing, is something that is identical to the desire for Jewish statehood and Jewish sovereignty in Palestine. Now, if you go back and you look at people who talked about Zion and talked about returning to Zion, they were religious Jews who saw this as either a personal duty or something that would happen in God's time. They were not talking about it as something that was a modern national project, partly because this is in the 16th and 15th and 14th and 11th and 17th century. There were no national projects. Modern nation-state nationalism basically did not exist. People say, of course it existed. Look at England. The English brought a Dutchman to rule them in 1688 just because he was a Protestant. Didn't even speak English. They brought a German. They brought somebody from Hanover, George I, in 1720 to rule over, again, because he was a Protestant. The idea that this nationalism goes way, 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 way back, yeah, there are elements of it in England and in Holland and in France and a couple of other Western European countries before the 19th century. But modern nation-state nationalism is a 200-year-old project at the earliest for almost every country on earth. And that's true with Zionism as with every other modern national project. The longing for Zion has nothing to do with the desire for Jewish statehood and sovereignty in Palestine. And this is not the same as anything that preceded it. Again, there has always been a religious longing for Zion, for Jerusalem, in other words, in Judaism, but this should not be confused with modern political Zionism. Like most nation-state nationalisms, that is a 19th century phenomenon. Now, I could talk a little bit about how little traction Zionism had in most Jewish communities up until the 20th century. Most people feeling persecution in Eastern Europe either desired to assimilate or desired to emigrate. The number of people, the proportion of people who saw Zionism as the ideal outlet for the persecution they were suffering in the Russian Empire or in Austro-Hungary or in other parts of Europe was a tiny, tiny minority. It was an elite minority. It was intellectuals. It was people of influence in many cases. But it was a minority. Most people voted with their feet and came to the United States or to Canada or to Argentina or to Australia or to South Africa, which is why you have large Jewish communities in all of those countries. Many other people simply said, we want to change the countries we're in. They became communists, they became social democrats, they joined parties like the Bund, and they tried to change the countries they were in, tried to fight anti-Semitism in Russia or in Austria-Hungary or wherever it may have been. Zionism was anathema to most Jewish elites in these societies. The only cabinet member of the British cabinet that voted on the Balfour Declaration who opposed it, well, there were two. One of them was the only Jewish member of cabinet. And an old imperialist, Lord Curzon, who said, no, this is very bad for the empire. But that's different. From the beginning, Zionist leaders, starting with Herzl, did not think they could do this on their own. They understood that they needed external support. They looked to European powers, they looked to foreign powers to help them to colonize these non-European lands, whether they were talking at the outset of Uganda or Argentina or Sinai, or eventually, as they decided, it had to be Palestine. They saw the support of great powers as essential to achieving their aims. Otherwise, Herzl wouldn't have gone to the German Kaiser, he wouldn't have gone to the Ottoman Sultan, he wouldn't have gone to the French Third Republic for support. And in Herzl's words, they saw the state that they envisioned in Palestine, and I'm quoting his book Der Judenstaat, as I quote now, a rampart of Europe against Asia, an outpost of civilization as opposed to barbarism. So this was the selling point to an imperial Europe which saw itself as superior to the rest of the world, which saw itself as representing civilization and saw everybody else as essentially a bunch of barbarians. Herzl was appealing to that sentiment, appealing to great powers which saw the world in that way. And obviously he himself saw the world in that way. These views were in keeping with European views of non-Europeans in an era where European colonialism was still expanding, in an era where European settlers were still taking over non-European lands. Hawaii is taken over in the 1890s, the Philippines in the early 20th century. Other European powers are expanding in Africa. And these were seen as entirely positive phenomenon by Europeans. There was nothing wrong in their view with imperialism. There was nothing wrong in their view with colonialism. There was nothing wrong in their view with exterminating or expelling indigenous populations and having European populations take their place. That was happening in Algeria. That was happening in South Africa. That was happening on the fringes of the American empire on this continent, and it was happening in many other places. This was, in the views of Europe, at least a good thing. And Zionism latched onto that. From the very beginning, it saw itself as part of that European movement of the day and continued to see itself in that way right up until World War II, where suddenly colonialism is in bad odor. And we'll talk about how that changes the situation of Zionism. So it was in this European environment that modern political Zionism developed as a national movement in terms of Eastern European nationalisms, with which it has enormous amount of similarity in the face of growing anti-Semitism and persecution. So it had roots in religious Zionism, but it was essentially an effort to develop a modern nation state from a Jewish people who until that point had not seen themselves in terms of a nation state, had not seen themselves in terms of territorial sovereignty. And since territorial sovereignty meant you had to do something with the people who inhabited that land, it was necessary to deal with them. And there's actually very few references in all of Herzl's writings, whether his diaries or his several books, to what he intends to do. There are very few references in Weizmann's writings to these things. I'll talk about another leader who had a different view in a minute. But at one point, he says in his diary, Herzl, we need to spirit the penniless population across the borders. And this, he said later on, has to be done discreetly and circumspectly. In other words, he understood that there would be resistance to it. He understood that this was not going to be an easy thing. It had to be done quietly. He said we would deny them employment in our country, in other words, in this Jewish state that he was envisaging, and oblige them to go elsewhere. If that reminds you a little bit of some statements about Gaza in the last 2 years, you're not mistaken. There's a through line in thinking between Herzl and between some of the people in the current Israeli government. So this was almost unanimously recognized as a colonizing enterprise by most Zionists. Only one of them was really utterly blunt about it. And this was a man named Zev Jabotinsky. Now, some people have argued, why do you emphasize Jabotinsky so much? Why don't you talk about nice people like Herzl or Weizmann or Ben-Gurion, who very rarely say the kind of crude things that Jabotinsky says? A, because most of the other people are being deceptive, like Herzl saying we have to do this discreetly. It's in his diaries, it's not public, discreetly, circumspectly. Or they're lying to themselves. Jabotinsky, to his enormous credit, was not lying to anybody. And what I'm about to read you was not in his diary. It was in an article that he wrote in 1923, originally in Russian, entitled The Iron Wall, We and the Arabs. And in it, he was trying to puncture some of the balloons of self-deception and deception that other Zionist leaders were floating, saying, there's no problem here, these people will just go away, or they don't even exist, or we don't have to worry about them. He wrote in 1923, and these are selections from this article. The entire article is available online. It's only 7 pages. You can read it. It's on your syllabus. Jabotinsky, last thing I want to say about Jabotinsky, he's not some minor figure. He's not a minor figure. There are mountains in Israel named for him. There are settlements named for him, for Zev Jabotinsky. If you see a place named such and such Zev, Har Zev or whatever, named for Jabotinsky. Why? He is the spiritual father of the political trend which has dominated Israeli politics since the 1970s. The descendant of Jabotinsky's revisionist movement is the Likud party, which has governed Israel for most of the last 50 years, since 1977, on and off in coalition sometimes. So he's an important figure. He's the spiritual father of the dominant political trend in Israel for half a century, which is most of its existence. Jabotinsky wrote in 1923, "Every native population in the world resists colonists, as long as it has the slightest hope of being able to rid itself of the danger of being colonized. That is what the Arabs in Palestine are doing, and what they will persist in doing as long as there remains a solitary spark of hope that they will be able to prevent the transformation of Palestine, in scare quotes, into the land of Israel, in scare quotes." He goes on at a different point in the same article. "Zionist colonization can proceed and develop only under the protection of a power that is independent of the native population, behind an iron wall," that's where the title of the article comes from, "which the native population cannot breach." And he later on says, ultimately we have to provide this for ourselves, but at this point we need someone else to provide it for us. In fact, they still need someone else to provide it for them. F-15s are not Israeli manufactured, nor are F-35s, nor are Apache helicopters. He concludes, this is another passage towards the end, "If you wish to colonize a land in which people are already living, you must find a garrison for the land, or find a benefactor who will provide a garrison on your behalf." B-2 bombers over Tehran. "Zionism is a colonizing venture, and therefore it stands or falls on the question of armed forces." If you want to know where Netanyahu and most other Likud leaders get their ideas from, they go back to Jabotinsky. Netanyahu's father was Jabotinsky's principal secretary for a short time. He was also a very bad historian of Jewish Spain. Almost every proper historian of Jewish Spain disagrees with him fundamentally, but that's another issue. Now, I just said this was almost universally recognized as a colonizing enterprise by most Zionists, though they were not as blatant about it as was Jabotinsky or as Frank. The best example of this is how widely accepted and uncontroversial the idea was for decades and decades and decades, from the 1870s onwards. One of the main Zionist land purchase agencies was called the Jewish Colonization Agency. People say, how can you talk about settler colonialism? They were talking about settler colonialism. This institution existed till the 1950s, for God's sakes. It bought tons of land from absentee landlords. It's one of the main instruments of Zionism. It's called the Jewish Colonization Agency. I mean, what more can you ask for in terms of self-definition than this land purchase agency having that name? So it's not some anti-Semitic slur. You can't say these things in some American universities that have accepted the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's twisted definition of anti-Semitism, which has nothing to do with anti-Semitism, has to do with criticism of Israel. But read Jabotinsky, and you're effectively violating the IHRA, and therefore will get into trouble with some disciplinary panel in your university. Be very careful. And if you want to fight, go ahead and fight, but the deck is stacked against you in those proceedings. Okay, now, something changed by the 1950s when the Jewish Colonization Agency went out of business. The world was now in an era of post-World War II decolonization. Colonists were no longer regarded favorably. Eventually, even South Africa came to be seen unfavorably. The French were driven out of Algeria, and the world had changed. Moreover, the Zionists had come into conflict with the British after World War II. I'll go back and talk about that in a minute. And therefore, Zionism rebranded itself. There's a lot to do with branding in this national movement. Zionism is not just a military or a political or an ideological project. Among many other things, it's a public relations project, a very successful one. And the self-branding has been fantastically effective. And one of the things that they did is they leapt in like 5 years from being the darling stepchild of imperialism to being an anti-colonial power. We liberated ourselves from British imperialism after they had suckled at the, I won't say it, of Britain for 20-odd years. It's a remarkable, remarkable achievement. I mean, if you can get away with that, you can get away with anything. And they did. They sold this all over the world. We are an anti-colonial movement. We fought the British. They did fight the British, but they weren't an anti-colonial movement. In any case, so this was a really important shift for Zionism, and it enabled them to do a great deal. I want to next move to a different set of topics, and I want to talk about the impact on Palestine of a variety of events that took place in the 1930s. I've already said that Britain had suppressed a number of revolts and uprisings by the Palestinians in the early 1920s a couple of times, and in 1929 a very severe one. But things got much, much worse in the 30s, and I'm going to talk about the 30s now. And I'm going to end today by finishing up with the 30s and World War II. There were two key developments that changed fundamentally the course of events in Palestine, and that in some respects determined the future of Palestine, and for that matter, the future of Israel. One of these developments was exogenous, in other words, it was entirely external to Palestine, and one of them was endogenous, it was internal to Palestine. The first of them, the external development, was the rise to power in Germany of the Nazis and of Adolf Hitler in early 1933. This was, of course, the trigger for all kinds of events that we're not going to talk about. The Second World War, the extermination of most of the German population of Europe, and many other things resulted, obviously, from the rise to power of Hitler. But it had a profound effect on Palestine and on the fate of the Zionist movement. It's actually one of the most important events in modern Palestinian history, although it is entirely exogenous. It had nothing to do with the Palestinians or the Zionists or the British or anybody else. It was a German development, purely German development, totally exogenous. Now, back in the late 20s, in 1929 to be exact, a global depression had struck the entire world. And as a consequence, the Zionist project was in deep, deep trouble. The numbers tell the story. This was a project that was based on two, like any colonizing project, two key strategic assets: people, land. Control land, not just any land, fertile land, strategic land, and increase your demographic weight, and you can do things. If you fail to control land and you fail to control or develop your demographic potency, then you will fail. It was absolutely essential. And so purchase of land, getting the British to rewrite the land regulations so that they could snooker their way into control of land, finding absentee landlords in Beirut or in Amman or in Damascus or in Jaffa or Haifa who would sell land or needed money for whatever reason. Finding middlemen so that somebody would sell land thinking they were selling it to another Arab, and that person would then be a middleman, a simsar, who would sell it to the Jewish Colonization Agency or another land purchase agency. These were the two motors of the Zionist project, as they are the motors of any settler-colonial project. I mean, here, bringing in immigrants and stealing land from the native population. That's the key to the expansion of the white American empire. And it was the key to the expansion of South African and Algerian and Kenyan and every other settler-colonial project, Australian, and so on. And the numbers tell the story. From a Jewish population in Palestine, which was about 6% of the total population in 1917, the Jewish proportion of the population had risen to 26% by 1926. It has gone from just over 5% or 6% to over a quarter, which meant population was increasing, and the possibility of success based on this demographic progression was at least possible, visible. All of this, of course, thanks to British encouragement of immigration, and also thanks to the racist 1924 American Immigration Act, which kept dark people, Jews, Arabs, Catholics, Italians, and other undesirable, non-Protestant, non-white, non-Northern European people out of the United States. Go back and read about it. 1924 Immigration Act, one of the most racist acts in American history. And the 1905 Alien Exclusion Act, which was intended to keep Jews out of Britain at a time of great need by people being persecuted in Russia. So partly thanks to British support for immigration to Palestine, and partly thanks to these racist immigration laws in places like the United States and other Australia and so on, the population had risen by 1926 to the proportion of the Jewish population to total population had risen to 26%. With the Depression, the flow of immigrants, as well as the flow of capital, and this is also, I mean, you can talk about land and you can talk about people, but you also have to have capital. And that was one of the things that the Zionist project was brilliant in mobilizing. Zev Sternhell, a very fine Israeli historian, has calculated that the inflow of capital to the Jewish community in Palestine in the 1920s was somewhat larger than the GDP of the Jewish sector of the economy in every one of the years in the 1920s. Imagine, that's like a huge pipeline of capital coming in. It enables land purchase, it enables investment in the city of Tel Aviv. Where does Tel Aviv come from? I mean, it's an enormous amount of building takes place. The place is founded just before World War I, and it's already a city by the 30s. That requires a lot of capital, people, obviously, but land, but it requires capital. And the capital was there. With the Depression, both the flow of immigrants and the flow of capital dry up for reasons that have nothing to do with Palestine or Zionism. It's the global economy. From a high in 1926 of 26%, the Jewish proportion of the population of Palestine had shrunk to 17.8% by 1932. So instead of going up, it was going down. In other words, they were losing the demographic battle. Palestinians were now more than 4/5 of the population, whereas Palestinian Arabs, whereas they had been 3/4 of the population back in 1926. This was an enormous crisis. And if you're interested in the political minutiae, you can look at the way in which this affected the perspectives of Zionist leaders. Some of them began to negotiate with Arab leaders in ways that they never had been willing to do in the 1920s, because they suddenly said, maybe this project is going to be less successful than we always assumed, given the way we thought those curves would continue upward, continue to rise. The rise to power of Hitler, the incredible persecution of the Jewish population of Germany, and also similar but less draconian rules that were being implemented in other Eastern European countries. Later on, after Anschluss, Austria. Later on, after the Sudetenland was taken, parts of Czechoslovakia. And independently in many other, Hungary, Poland, Romania, under neo-fascist regimes that were emulating Hitler. Extraordinary discriminatory laws were being passed and imposed. In Germany, they were the most draconian. People were stripped of citizenship, people were kicked out of their jobs, and a highly assimilated, highly educated, highly integrated German Jewish community suddenly were non-people. And at this stage, the Nazis simply wanted to get them out of Germany. It was only later that the final solution is adopted. It's only later that concentration camps are feeders for death camps. At this stage, there were concentration camps. There were no death camps yet. And anybody who could leave, who could get a visa, anybody who had the ability to get sponsors abroad could leave. But no one would let them in. The United States wouldn't let them in. Absolutely not, under no circumstances. Those laws were not changed until the 1960s. The racist laws of 1924 were not changed in this country until the 1960s. They made some dispensations in the 40s for displaced persons, but we're talking about a few tens of thousands of people. Hundreds of thousands could have been saved had the United States or countries like Canada and others that had these racist laws, Australia, agreed to take them in. But Palestine was open for immigration. And very soon after the Nazis came to power, they and the Jewish Agency negotiated something called a transfer agreement, whereby German Jews could emigrate from Germany with some of their capital, if that capital was used to buy German goods. So the Nazis were getting something. They stole most of their wealth. They allowed them to take some of their assets with them on the condition that those assets were used to purchase German goods. In 1935 alone, as a result of the rise to power of Hitler, immigration started shooting up in 1933, and it continued to rise. In 1935, 61,000 Jewish immigrants, which is a number larger than the entire Jewish population of Palestine in 1917, arrived in Palestine. And those are legal immigrants. There were many others who arrived illegally. By World War II, by 1939, from a 17.8% proportion of the population in 1932, the Jewish population of Palestine had grown to 32%. They were almost a third of the population. They'd gone from under a fifth to over a third, from 174,000 people back in 1931, 32, to 445,000 people. In the same period, due to these capital inflows as a result of the transfer agreement, the increasingly self-segregated Jewish sector of the Palestinian economy became larger than the Arab sector of the economy. In other words, this capital finally flowing as of 33, 34, once that agreement was negotiated, revived the Jewish economy of Palestine and made it bigger than the Arab sector for the first time. David Ben-Gurion, who, as you know, later became the first prime minister of Israel, wrote jubilantly in his diary at this time, I quote him now, "Immigration at a rate of 60,000 a year means a Jewish state in all of Palestine." He was ecstatic. He said, this is it. We have the land. I'm going to talk about the guns, but now we have the people. We're already a third, and if we can keep this up, we will have the capacity to take this country over. Ben-Gurion wasn't the only person who understood the meaning of this profound demographic transformation that was triggered by the rise of the Nazis, and I want to talk about that right now. The Palestinians were not stupid. I'm sorry. Oh boy, that's being amplified. The remains of a cold. Palestinians, as I said, were not stupid. They could see precisely the same implications of this demographic transformation as did Ben-Gurion. A few years earlier, the editor of the leading Palestinian newspaper of the day, a newspaper called Palestine, which is actually was edited by my wife's grandfather, had written a prescient editorial which was entitled "Strangers in Our Own Land." I quote this at any time I can, because what he was warning was that this could be the future, the impending future for the Palestinians, that they would become strangers in their own land. And suddenly, by 1936, Palestinians realized that that actually was getting closer and closer, and that they soon would become, 60,000 a year, they would soon become strangers in their own land. So Palestinian society was shaken by these demographic realities, and they were combined with a number of other factors in the early 1930s. First of all, the Depression had hurt the Palestinian economy as well as the Jewish economy of Palestine. There were very high levels of rural and urban unrest, as land purchases from absentee landlords drove more and more peasants off the land and into urban shanty towns. They didn't find work in the shanty towns. They became discontented. People in the countryside who'd lost agrarian employment were also dissatisfied. So you had economic and social conditions were boiling all over Palestine among the Arab population in the early 1930s. People were reacting as well to the failure of the leadership, the Palestinian leadership, made up of elite, aristocratic members of old families, non-democratic, very closed off, incapable of shaking off a habit of deference to the ruler. These are people who in many cases had grown up under the Ottomans. They were used to being intermediaries with a power that they could negotiate with. You couldn't negotiate with the British. There was no negotiating with the British. Right up until 1939, the British said, you have to accept the terms of the mandate. In the terms of the mandate, you don't exist. So you don't exist. You have to accept that. And that was all they would say to them. They didn't say you don't exist. They say accept the terms of the mandate. The Palestinians say, we're not here. This negates us. This very document negates us. And say, well, that's what the League of Nations is. Nothing to do with us, the League of Nations. Of course, the British had drafted the damn thing in the League of Nations, but that's another issue. So there was deep, deep anger at the failure of this conciliatory leadership to deal effectively with the British, who had continuously stonewalled them every time they'd send a delegation to London, every time they'd meet with the High Commissioner after High Commissioner, they would get nowhere. And they would refuse to take actions that were effective against the British. At the same time, other peoples in the Arab region were gaining at least nominal independence. Egypt negotiated independence in 1936. It had been nominally independent in 1922, but they had a new treaty in 36. The Syrians negotiated a treaty in 36. The Iraqis obtained, again, nominal independence in 1932. Now, the British continued to control, or the French in the case of Syria and Lebanon, these countries, but they at least had their own governments. They at least felt that Palestinians could look there and say, that's steps towards self-determination. We don't have any form of representation. We're not allowed to elect anybody or anything. They were allowed to elect mayors, that's it. But they were not allowed to elect an assembly. The Jewish community had an assembly, which elected assembly, which was representative, and which was the origins later on of the Knesset. The Palestinians were not allowed this by the British, at the same time as other Arab countries also under mandate were getting those kinds of representative institutions and were beginning to free themselves from European control. Finally, there were two other factors that were really important at this time. One of them was the rise of a much more militant, middle-class, mass-based leadership organized in political parties like the Istiqlal Party. Istiqlal means independence, who argued, you can't talk to the British. You have to strike. You have to boycott them. You have to do what the Indians do, what the Congress Party did. You have to do what any self-respecting national movement does. Don't go with your wives to their tea parties. Don't play tennis with them. Boycott them. Treat them like the aliens that they are. And for the aristocratic leader, heaven forbid, many of them had jobs within the mandatory administration. Subordinate jobs, but jobs. And suddenly they were being attacked from below by new high school graduates, by teachers, by lawyers, by government employees, by people of a large and growing middle class who were reading about what was happening in other Arab countries, reading about what was happening in India, reading about what was happening in other colonized countries where national liberation movements were taking off, and saying, why don't we have something like this? Finally, out in the countryside, there was the beginning of a tendency to argue for armed struggle against the British. The person who more than anybody else represented this trend was a Syrian by the name of Sheikh Qassam, Qassam. There are articles on him in your readings if you want to go further. I'll say a couple of words about him. He's a really interesting character. He was a preacher from Syria. He helped to organize resistance to the Italians in Libya in 1911. He fought against the French in Syria in 1920, 21, 22, and they took over Syria. And then he fled to Palestine. He established himself as a preacher near Haifa, or in Haifa, and became a itinerant ma'zoon. He would marry people in the villages because they had and preach to them. And as he was doing this, while he was preaching and while he was marrying and while he was offering advice, he was organizing. He would find people who had the right orientation in his view. He would talk to them about, how it's necessary to fight European imperialism, how Islam is important in this struggle, and so on and so forth. And he eventually had a whole network of people all across Galilee and the northern part of what is today the West Bank, which he established literally over about 20 years of clandestine work with nobody really knowing he was doing this. Some of the people in parties like Istiqlal, some of these middle-class guys were working with him, but essentially, he was doing this more or less as far as we know. I mean, it's hard to tell. He was killed. Many of his closest associates were killed. They didn't sit down and write down what they were doing. But as far as we can tell, he did a lot of this by himself. And by the end, he had established a network which later on was the backbone of the Great Revolt of 1936-39. He was tipped off in the fall of 1935 to the fact that the British might be onto him. And so he decided to join a group of his closest comrades and head for the hills. and he was on his way to the hills when a British police patrol ambushed them. Qassam and several of his supporters were killed, a few others were wounded and captured, a bunch of others escaped. The ones who escaped became the greatest military leaders of the Great Revolt of the following year. So all of these elements were triggers for this revolt, this massive increase in immigration, this growing unrest in the countryside and increasingly in the cities, the failure of the leadership, the universally perceived failure of the leadership. The oldest leader of the so-called Arab executive, the Palestinian Arab executive, was beaten to the ground by British mounted policemen and died of concussions, apparently, a couple of months later. And from that point on, the leadership lost all credibility. This is the father of Abdul Qadir al-Husseini, the grandfather of Faisal Husseini, for what it's worth. And with his death in 1933, in a demonstration, actually, against the British, the leadership lost its credibility. And you had these new leaderships coming up from the middle classes, and you finally had this rural movement, which at this point was still clandestine. Until the British ambushed Qassam, nobody really knew about it. And the astonishing thing you read about in 1935 is that the funeral of Qassam was not just some little affair where a few hundred people follow the cortege to the grave. Thousands, tens of thousands of people attended Qassam's funeral. And suddenly everybody realized, oh my God, he's been organizing villages all over the country. And these villagers are coming to Haifa for the funeral by the tens of thousands. And you read in the diaries of people, people who were working on their diaries at the time, this shocked everybody. People who attended the funeral, they said, I knew who he was. I thought he was important. I went to his funeral. And I found all these people, these fallahin, these peasants from places, 30, 20, 40 kilometers away, 50 kilometers away, had come to his funeral. It was a national event. And from that point on, it was clear that things were beginning to change in Palestine. All of these were triggers for this great revolt that erupted in April 1936. It started with a 6-month general strike, which some historians have said is the longest general strike in colonial history. I actually don't know if that's true. Don't assume that it is, but that's what people have said. Immediately, the Arab rulers, all of them beholden to the British, stepped in after 6 months because this was leading to unrest in their countries. Palestinian resistance was leading to people saying, why don't we stand up to the British more vigorously? If these guys are on a general strike and they're trying to force the British out, why can't we do the same thing? We're negotiating for independence, but they still have a garrison in the citadel in Cairo. They still have a garrison in Damascus. They still have garrisons in Beirut and in Baghdad. Let's get these bastards out. And so they were worried about the unrest, and they formed a delegation, the Arab rulers, and in time-honored fashion, serving their British masters, they persuaded the Palestinians to stop the general strike. They said, the British will offer concessions. We guarantee that the British will offer concessions. Well, a couple of months later, the British the British love doing this, they formed a commission, the Peel Commission. And the commission looked into the causes of unrest. And they decided, well, this is not solved. There's no solution except partition. We're going to cut the country up. We're going to give a small chunk of it as a Jewish state. We're going to keep a chunk of it for Britain. And we're going to give the rest of it to an independent Arab ruler, King Abdullah of Jordan, whose army is controlled and run by the British. Its commander is British. Its officers are British. Its armament is British. Its funding is British. It's a British force. So the British basically keep most of the country. And there's a Jewish state. As far as the Palestinians were concerned, they were worse off under that solution than they were to begin with. And that triggered the most furious phase of the revolt, starting in April of 1937. It became a nationwide armed conflagration. This partition plan was just a trigger. Things were obviously, turning in that direction anyway. It constituted the greatest challenge to British imperial hegemony in the Middle East in all the decades before World War II. It was a defining event for the British Empire, and one of the greatest anti-colonial revolts of the entire anti-war period. There was actually a bigger one in Morocco in the mid-20s, but this was probably the second biggest. The revolt challenged British authority and power in most parts of Palestine. The rebels took over most rural areas, some of them for very long periods of time, for 8 months, a year, starting in late 1937, mid-1937 to late 1937. By 1938, they controlled much of the countryside. They established alternative forms of governance, alternative forms of justice, alternative forms of tax collection. The British said, of course, this is extortion. They're extorting people. Well, no, they were trying to govern. They were collecting taxes. There's a very good article that I've included on this in your readings if you want to go further with that. It was a situation that the British could not possibly accept. They could not possibly accept loss of control of Palestine. It was still as strategically important to them in 1937, 38, 39 as it had been in 1902, 5, 10, 15, 17 when they issued the Balfour Declaration for the same reasons. They needed to protect their control of the Suez Canal. They needed to control the shortest land route to India, across which now ran an oil pipeline, a major road, and a whole string of air bases, which were the way that the RAF moved planes from Europe to India to the Far East. This was now even more essential to the British Empire, this connection through Palestine, than it had been in the minds of British strategists before World War I. They could not lose control of Palestine. At the same time, it was having an impact throughout the colonized world. It inspired nationalist and anti-colonial forces in Egypt, in India, in North Africa, in Indonesia, in many, many parts of the world. I mean, it takes the historians of each of these countries to tell you what impact it had. It had different impacts in different places. It had a huge impact in India. I'll talk about that in a minute. Now, the British had to crush it. And they did crush it. They brought in 100,000 British troops. They armed and trained tens of thousands of auxiliaries from the Zionist militias. I'll talk about that in a minute. They used air power, extensively bombing villages, attacking rebels in the hills. They used the Royal Navy. The end result was a devastating defeat for the Palestinian national movement, which didn't recover for a couple of decades. The movement was shattered. Most of the leaders were either executed. The British executed anybody found in possession of weapons. Sheikh Farhan Saadi, one of Qassam's closest associates, was captured by the British, and they were gonna have to just throw him in prison. And then they found in one of his pockets a bullet, and they executed him on that basis. An 85-year-old man, but a great rebel leader. So many rebel leaders were executed. Essentially, if you were caught in possession of a weapon, you were killed. You were shot on the spot, or in some cases taken before a kangaroo military court-martial. Britain brought the country under martial law. Civil law was suspended. Military courts were basically kangaroo courts. They just basically condemned everybody under a whole new legal regime that they created based on emergency laws that they had used in India, based on emergency laws that they'd used in Ireland in particular. In fact, some of them were copied from the Irish emergency laws of the 1918, 1920, 21, when they were fighting against the Irish War of Independence. So the leaders were executed or exiled. Many of the leaders were exiled for 5, 6, 7 years. My uncle was exiled until the mid-40s. They took him away in 37. He wasn't allowed to return until, I think, 44 or 43. Many others weren't allowed to return even after that. Some never came back, were never allowed to come back. The population was disarmed. I'll tell you about some of the methods that were used. The British would enter a village. They would say, we know that there are rebels here, and if there are rebels here, there are arms. We want the arms. People wouldn't accept to give up the arms. They would collect all the men. They would line them up, and they would say, every 8th man will be shot until you produce the arms. And then they would start shooting, and sometimes they would get the arms, sometimes they wouldn't. Sometimes they would kill them all. This was standard practice for the British Army, and it was not, as I'm going to mention, it was not unique to Palestine. This was British counterinsurgency doctrine. There were books taught in British military academies, taught in British staff colleges. One of them called Small Wars, by a man called Major General Sir Charles Colwell, which talked about how you had to attack the civilian population in order to uproot a rebellion. And the details of it are gruesome, as they were practiced in Palestine. The revolt resulted in the death, wounding, imprisonment, or exile of between 15 and 17% of the adult male population of Palestine. The population of Palestine was about 1 million people. Half of them were women. More than half of them, or half of that half, were children. So you're talking 300,000 men. The British had 100,000 soldiers. They had 50,000 auxiliaries, police, and mobilized militias, the Zionist militias, against 300,000 adult males. So there's one soldier or policeman to every 2 adult males. It was no wonder that the British overcame the Palestinians. Now, why were the British so desperate? 37-38 was not just a period of unrest in Palestine. 1937-38 is the lead up to World War II. It's an era in which Britain and France are rearming because they realize that Germany is rearming. Not everybody expects or wants war, but increasingly British elites realize they're going to fight Germany. And Germany is probably going to be allied with Italy. And this is going to be a repeat in some respects of World War I. And World War I was largely fought in the Middle East. The Gallipoli campaign, the Iraq campaign, the Sinai campaign, the Palestine campaign, all fought in the Middle East in World War I, the Libya campaign. And so the British realized that they really had to bring this rebellion under control. But they were mobilizing their army and needed to keep a large bulk of it in Europe, just in case things with the Germans deteriorated even further. They had a huge army in India. They had a British Indian army of 200,000 men and tens of thousands of British soldiers. Since the 1857 revolution in India, the British had decided you had to have X number of British soldiers to Y number of Indian soldiers, just to keep control. And you had to have British officers over all the Indian units. But that Indian army was not considered reliable for use in this colonial war because the Indians were sympathizing with the Palestinians. And the British were actually afraid if we bring Indian units over, as they had done in World War I to fight their wars, and as they later were to do in World War II to fight their war, in Palestine they might not fight. So the British were desperate. What they ended up doing, in addition to bringing in 100,000 British soldiers and tens of thousands and thousands of British police and the RAF, was to mobilize Zionist militias. And I'll talk about how they incorporated them into the police services, up to the level of about 40,000 of them. I'll talk about that in a minute. Now, the tactics that they used were not, as I said, unique to Palestine. They decided that entire villages or entire regions were rebels, and anybody in that region was potentially considered to be a target. But they used, both the army and the police, classic tactics that they had developed over more than a century in India, in Africa, in Ireland, whereby they not only attacked rebels, they also attacked the civilian population that supported these rebels. And this was not the undisciplined action of a few bad apples in the British officer corps. This was the doctrine that they were taught at Sandhurst and Woolwich. This is the doctrine they were taught in the General Staff College. This is the doctrine I've mentioned Major General Caldwell in his book, Small Wars. He talks about attack their cattle, attack their crops, attack their villages. The moral effect of violence against civilian populations is essential. You have to overawe them. I mean, this is pounded into their skulls as cadets, British officers, in early 1900s. The book's written in 1896. It's republished again. It's in print and used in British academies all through the 30s and into the 1950s. A version of it is in print and used at the U.S. Command and Staff College at Fort Leavenworth to this day. Small Wars. You can find it online. Small Wars, Caldwell. You can get it, download it. Still there. The latest edition. So this was doctrine. Destroying homes, destroying crops, destroying trees, shooting prisoners, torturing prisoners, detention without trial, a punitive legal regime, were the system that Britain had employed everywhere when rebellion threatened their rule. It's what Caroline Elkins, in her wonderful book, Legacy of Violence, A History of the British Empire, called legalized lawlessness. This is before the modern rules of war had evolved as they have evolved since World War II. But these things were illegal even by British standards. And if you read Colwell carefully, he admits it. He said, these are not things we would do in civilized countries. And as I say, they had been honed over a very, very long time. Now, there are two sequels to this unappetizing story, very important sequels. The British couldn't use their Indian army. The British had huge numbers of troops tied down in Europe, afraid of another European war. So what did they do? They decided to turn to the Jewish agency, and they said, you have militias. Give us your best militiamen. We will train them, we will organize them, we will arm them, and we will turn them into a variety of auxiliary forces to the police. There was a group called the Supernumerary Police. There was another group called the Jewish Settlement Police. There were a dozen other names for the units within which the British encadred, organized, trained, and armed Jewish auxiliary, Zionist auxiliary units. All of them with the organization and cooperation of the Jewish agency. And in fact, histories of the Israeli army say they saw this as the building up for them of an army. They said, the British will train these people, but they belong to us. You are working for us, but you're working for the British because we have a common enemy right now. In addition, these people, by the way, become the backbone. We're talking about maybe 40,000 militiamen, trained as policemen, trained as auxiliary forces to the British, on top of 100,000 British soldiers and maybe 10,000 British police. So we're talking 150,000 armed forces. In addition to this, the British incorporated selected members of these militias into joint British Zionist units called Special Night Squads, formed by a character by the name of Ord Wingate, W-I-N-G-A-T-E. If you know Hebrew and you research Wingate, or if you're Israeli and you know about the Israeli army, you know that Wingate is considered the father of Israeli military doctrine. He is the man who trained many of the leading generals. Moshe Dayan was trained by Wingate. Yigal Allon was trained by Wingate. The first commander of the Palmach, Yitzhak Ben Sadeh, was trained by Wingate. Dozens and dozens and dozens of people who later became generals were trained by Wingate in these special night squads, in which they carried out the atrocities that British troops were carrying out. But Wingate was a particularly sadistic, psychotic character, according to the men who served under him. Both Zionist and British soldiers who served under him said the man was mad. Churchill said he was mad. Bernard Montgomery, who was his commander, his division commander, said he's too mad for command. And Montgomery was a butcher. So you're talking about someone who, considered atrocities acceptable and normal. He thought even Wingate had overdone it. Nevertheless, his training was essential to the formation of a cadre of people who really become very important in Israeli military doctrine. Doing things, as I've said, like torturing and executing prisoners, blowing up homes over their inhabitants, and so on and so forth. Tying prisoners to the front of trucks and trains so that if there's a landmine, it will kill the prisoners first and protect the British soldiers, that kind of thing. The Israeli military historians are unanimous in ascribing to Wingate the core doctrines of the Israeli military. So Britain helped to create these large police forces that become the backbone of what later becomes the Haganah and the Palmach, and then later of the Israeli army. And individuals like Wingate trained a large number of people who later on become Israeli generals. I'm going to finish now. After crushing the Palestinian revolt, the British now faced the prospect of a war in Europe. By 1939, it was clear that war was imminent. They knew it would spill over to the Middle East because Mussolini was likely to ally himself with Hitler. The British said, we're in a very bad situation. We have alienated the entire Arab world. We have alienated much of the Muslim world. We've alienated most of the colonial world by our barbarity in Palestine. Much of this was not well reported in the West. Guess what? The Times of London did no better than the New York Times in reporting things. But it was well reported in the rest of the world. In India, for example, in Egypt, for example, the press was full of these atrocities, full of this barbarity of the British forces, full of the degree to which what the British were doing was just simply unacceptable. And so the British had a problem. They're going to have to fight in the Middle East amongst populations that hate them because of what they've done in Palestine. They were also under pressure from officials in India, who warned that if this simmering anger in India were not addressed, and now I'm quoting the Secretary of State for India in a memo to the cabinet in 1939, he said, if you do not do something about this, he said, serious trouble in India must be apprehended. In other words, we're going to have unrest in India if you don't do something about Palestine. And so the British decided in early 1939 to make concessions. And they did this in something they called the White Paper of 1939. This would have granted Palestine independence in 10 years, pending the approval of the Jewish Agency. So this all was waiting on them to say yes. But nominally, Palestine would have been independent in 10 years. It would have limited Jewish immigration, which had been unlimited before that, and it would have limited Jewish land purchase, which would have meant that the territorial and the demographic basis for a Jewish state would have been frozen. Zionist leaders immediately rejected it. Palestinian leaders were deeply divided. The Mufti was opposed because the British insisted on keeping him out. It was probably selfishness rather than any sense of strategic opportunity that this white paper offered. Other Palestinian leaders accepted, but the Palestinians were divided. The Zionists were unanimous in opposing it. They claimed that Britain had failed to fulfill its commitment in the Balfour Declaration. They said, you have not fulfilled your commitment. The British quite hypocritically said, well, we said Jewish national home. You have 450,000 people. That's a national home. We're done. We're finished. And after World War II, the Zionists were to rise in revolt against the British for a year and a half, 45, 46, until the British handed the issue over to the UN. Let me conclude by saying that what I've just talked about, I think, gives you several of the key elements of the post-World War II situation that the Palestinians faced. These things were already in place by the eve of World War II. Palestinian national movement had been crushed. Its leaders had been killed or remained in exile. The population had been disarmed. The population was disorganized. They were in no shape to confront the storm that was to hit them in 1947-48. The Zionists felt betrayed by the British. Yeah, that's their view, obviously. And I would argue that given what the British were privately saying to them, they were right. But the Zionists had already begun to explore other great power patrons. Weizmann and Ben-Gurion came to New York City, and they met in a hotel, I think over on Lexington Avenue, called the Biltmore. And they adopted a program which called for Palestine becoming a Jewish commonwealth, meaning a Jewish state. All of Palestine becoming a Jewish commonwealth. And they began to upgrade the process of trying to convince Americans of the justice of this cause, something which, incidentally, they didn't start in 1942. David Ben-Gurion and Yitzhak Ben-Zvi, who was the second president of Israel, first prime minister, second president, came here in World War I and worked here for years in New York City, building up a communications network, building up a funding network. Ben-Gurion used to come here regularly. So his visit in 1942 was part of a whole series of efforts to build up support among the Jewish community and among other people in the United States for Zionism, which up until World War II, up until the Holocaust, was still a minority among the American Jewish community. And they, at the same time, began to develop relationships with U.S. government people in the Roosevelt administration and in Congress that eventually resulted in American support for partition and a Jewish state in 1947. We'll talk about that next week. At the same time, other Zionist leaders, Golda Meir, who later became ambassador in Moscow when Israel was established, later foreign minister, later prime minister, Moshe Sharet, first foreign minister of Israel, later prime minister, they worked with Moscow in the same way, trying to convince the Soviets to support a Jewish state. When the war came, when the Nazis adopted their policy of extermination, of the so-called final solution, which had begun slowly with massacres and became industrial mass murder by 1942. When all of that happened, in the face of this tragedy and the sense of guilt that many people in Western countries felt, because those countries could have saved many of those people who later were murdered by the Nazis, Zionism took on a whole new aspect in the eyes of many people in Jewish communities and in the eyes of many others, whether out of sympathy or whether out of a sense of guilt or whether out of conviction that this was the right solution to a problem that the Nazis had how shall I put it, turned into this horror. In all of this, the Palestinians are divided, they were weakened, their only allies were weak and divided Arab governments, divided among themselves, and all of them operating in territories still under occupation by foreign armies. The British had a garrison in the citadel in Cairo. If you ever go to Cairo, the citadel is the highest point in the city. The British had a British flag there. Who controlled Egypt? Not the Egyptian government. The British controlled Egypt. Same was true all across the Middle East, even in countries that were nominally independent. The Palestinians now faced a Zionist movement that was even more motivated by the extermination of most of the European Jewish population, that had a government in embryo, which had been bequeathed to them by the British, and that had an army in waiting in the 40,000 militiamen whom the British had trained in the supernumerary police, the settlement police, and so on and so forth, and had led in raids into the countryside. So these were people who were not only armed and trained and organized by the British, they had been led in combat by the British. And the elite among them had been taken and formed into a Jewish brigade of the British Army that fought in Italy in World War II. That Jewish brigade produced 32 generals of the Israeli army. So there's a myth of, what's the word? Self-generation. Everything in Israel is created by the Zionist movement and by the pioneers and so on and so forth. Yes, well, but in the case of the armed forces, that was created by the British, actually. And if you read the better histories of the Israeli army, they will give you the clues to that. So they were now facing this much more motivated movement. I mean, the Holocaust was this horrific validation of some of the central ideas of Zionism. You can't live among these people. Look at what the Germans have just done. That was an enormous motivating factor. And you had in European and countries in the United States a sense of, we've got to do something about this. The outcome of a clash between them should have been a foregone conclusion, even without British backing for Zionism. The Palestinians just did not have either the ability to speak to European publics that the Zionist movement always had. And this is something that has been true for a very, very long time. It ceased to be quite as true today. Zionism was not a Middle Eastern product. It came out of Eastern Europe. It was created by Europeans and some Western Europeans. They were people who were of the cultures to which they were speaking. Herzl spoke accented Austrian German to his interlocutors. He spoke German like an Austrian. He was actually not from Austria. He was from another part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but he spoke perfect German, Austrian, accented German. The same was true of Herzl. Weizmann spoke perfect English. He had an accent, but he spoke perfect English. He grew up in England. He taught in English universities. The same was true of all Zionist leaders. They were immersed in European culture. They were part of the political and social and cultural environment in which they grew up. And then they came to Palestine. But they didn't lose that. I once heard Golda Meir speak. She was born in somewhere in what was then the Russian Empire. But she came to Milwaukee when she was a kid. She spoke perfect Midwestern English. She spoke perfect, if you listen to her speak. She's an American when she talks to Americans. I don't know what her Hebrew sounds like, but I know what her English sounded like. This was a person who understood the United States in a way that nobody who was brought up in the Middle East and maybe studied in the United States or immigrated to the United States and had essentially grown up in another world could possibly have emulated. And this was an advantage that obviously was enormously helpful to the people who were pleading for support for a Jewish state in Palestine. In the wake of World War II. Let me stop there. Not very uplifting, I'm afraid. It doesn't get much better. So if you're here for a You can watch the baseball scores. The Cubs won today, if that makes anybody happy. But I have nothing better for you tonight. So I'm happy to take any questions. I believe we have microphones. Please do make them questions. You don't have to. Yeah. You don't have to. I see hands over here. No, it's not. Now it is.
Is it working? Okay.
Now it is working.
I have a clarifying question on what you said in 1933. You described that the Jewish agency struck a deal with the Nazis or the rising Nazi party in Germany to let Jews be absorbed into Palestine and then in trade for like a trade agreements. But what was the legal paradigm that justified the Jewish agency to make that decision? Was it like the mandatory governments, or did the Jewish agency independently interact with the Nazi party to forge that relationship?
They contacted the Nazis independently. It had nothing to do with the mandatory government. It was just to let people immigrate. I mean, immigration was free. So the mandate had nothing to do with people arrived. They immediately got citizenship. And if they brought with them capital, they were free to do that. So it was an agreement with a foreign government by the Jewish agency, which had a certain degree of diplomatic standing because it was called a public body in the mandate for Palestine. It had diplomatic standing in places like the League of Nations in Geneva. So they could negotiate with the Germans, and the British had no objection. Thank you.
Me? Hi. Over here.
Oh, okay.
Hi,
Sorry.
I have a similar question. Could you elaborate on how, as the German government moved towards the final solution, how that did affect? Because I can't imagine that they were continually allowing, like, Jewish citizens to flee after a certain point, and like, did that shift affect like demographic growth at least for a period of time?
Three things. First of all, the agreement broke down after 2 years. Secondly, after 1936, immigration slowed enormously because the country was in revolt. So it was a situation of great instability, and it was dangerous. So immigration just stopped on its own to some extent. There was still immigration in 36, 37, 38, but much, much lower levels. And finally, in 1939, the Germans stopped allowing anybody to leave. By that stage, they had not yet gotten to, it was still concentration camps. It was not yet death camps, but they were already killing people. Once the war started, they started slaughtering people. And nobody was allowed to leave after that. It was too late. But up until 39, anybody who would get a visa could have left.
If they were stripped of citizenship, how could they get it? Who did the Jewish agency grant the visa?
The mandate allowed anybody who could prove that they were Jewish to get Palestine citizenship. So immigration to Palestine was possible even for people stripped of their citizenship. I think the Germans may have given people, what are they called? Refugee papers, just to get out. They wanted them out. I mean, at one point, Hitler was talking about sending all the Jews to Madagascar. The idea was simply to remove them from Germany. Later on, that changed, obviously. Two questions? 3 more questions.
One question I had, sort of based on the readings, and less about what you've talked about tonight, is I read in one of the books that the Palestinians paid taxes to the British, but the Zionist settlers did not.
No, everybody paid taxes.
They all paid taxes. Oh,
Yeah.
okay, all right. Well, I guess, so maybe this is not right, but I was thinking in terms of both the taxes they paid and maybe other things like cheap labor and selling the farms at a discount and stuff like that. Has anybody ever looked at the Palestinian economic contribution to the formation of Israel?
I mean, there are very good books on there are very good books on the economy of Palestine up until the end of the mandate, which show the development of the economy and the Arab share and the Jewish share. You're talking about a different subject, though, post-mandate, and there. My brother's an economist who actually worked on some of this stuff. So there are figures. There are people like the United Nations Commission on Trade and Development actually have some statistics on that.
I'm looking at almost like a reparations question.
Well, reparations have to do with property that was taken in 1948. We're going to get to that. Okay. Let's leave that for next week. Maybe one more here and one more here, and that's it.
So you talked about how the Jewish settlers were permitted to form an assembly, but the Palestinians were not. What was the reason for that? And you also mentioned that there were Palestinians who had jobs working with the British. Did they ever push for the right to assembly?
Yeah, the mandate itself, and I'm going to read the passage. It's in Article 2, I think. Yeah, the mandatory shall be responsible for placing the country under such political, administrative, and economic conditions as will secure the establishment of the Jewish national home as laid down in the preamble and the development of self-governing institutions. Now, when push came to shove, the only people who were granted self-governing institutions were the Jewish community. So the British denied that to the Arabs, but allowed that to the Zionists, because the people who took over were not just any old people. They were the Jewish agency. Which was a Zionist aid. And a very large proportion of the population, Jewish population of Palestine at that time were religious Jews who were not Zionists. So, somebody else from over here maybe? Or anywhere else, wherever? I don't have a mic. They have mics.
Appreciate the lecture, Professor. Your remarks on the uprisings during 1936 to 1939 were reminiscent of a lot of the people's struggles that were going on in that period. And for example, today there's an ongoing rebellion in the heart of India, led by the Communist Party India Maoist. And you have indigenous people rising up to fight against the oppressors who are trying to take over lands. And a pretty big issue that the movement is facing right now is repression. And much of the issues with repression, like the setbacks in the movement space, is a product of some of the issues internal to the organization, internal to the people's movement itself.
Right.
Like you have people betraying the movement, ultimately giving up the secrets that are involved in sustaining the movement. What were some of the issues that were going on in the internal to the Palestinian movement that led to the downfall?
Yes. I mean, I wish I had another hour to talk about Palestinian social structure and how that was an important element that the British were able to exploit in their divide and conquer policy. Because in addition to playing off the Jewish community against the Arab community, they played off segments of the Arab community against one another. In other words, when they organized the Palestine police in the 20s, they formed specific Druze and Circassian units. And they tried to also form Christian units. They didn't succeed there. They ended up forming separate units of the Palestine police from the Druze, the very small Druze and Circassian communities. This is the origin of what you have today in Israel, where Druze and Circassians are not considered Arabs, and where they're subject to the draft, and where they fight along as Jewish Israelis in the Israeli military. So from the British, Israel has inherited this ethno-religious divide and rule policy. In addition, you had class divisions, of course. The upper classes, by and large, did not want to fight with the British. Their economic interests militated against it. It was poorer people. It was peasants pushed off their land. It was peasants who ended up in shanty towns in the cities and who couldn't find employment, who were the most aggrieved, and who formed the basis of the revolt. And it was middle-class individuals who didn't benefit from the system, who were also involved in the rebellion. So many of them go out to the hills, join the rebels. Sort of like Mao and the intellectuals from 1919 who end up joining the Chinese Communist Party. They're not peasants. They're urban intellectuals. And you had that in Palestine. In addition, the British were able to do what they're able to do. They did this in India. They were able to win over a segment of the elite to rule with them. And so you always had a small segment of the Palestinian elite who aligned themselves either with the British or with the Jordanians, who were British clients. King Abdullah, Amir Abdullah then, later King Abdullah the First. That was a constant British. I mean, this is derived from Ireland, it's derived from India, it's derived from all the places, Egypt, all the places where the British had experience in this policy. You can read Lord Cromer's book, Modern Egypt, to see how he divides up Egyptian society with a view to using those divisions to control it. And that's what any government will do. That's what any ruler will do. The other thing is, they were absolutely ruthless. When rebellion raised its head, whether in Ireland or India or anywhere else, the British were absolutely ruthless. They had absolutely no compunction in violating their own laws, in bringing in martial law, which was not law. It was just regular, what Caroline Elkins called legalized lawlessness. And essentially killing anybody that they chose to kill. And nobody was ever punished for that. I mean, these descriptions that you find in accounts of the revolt of 36-39, of soldiers just shooting people indiscriminately. Nobody is ever punished for that. That is what you are supposed to do. That's how you bring these people under control. They did the same thing in Ireland. They would just shoot people in the street. They burned the city of Cork, for God's sakes, to punish whoever it was who ambushed a British patrol. You ambush a British patrol, we will burn your downtown. Cork is not a village. Cork is a city. They burned the center of a whole city as punishment and killed a number of people as punishment for an attack on a British patrol. This is in 1920. So if they're willing to do these kinds of things to white Christian European Boers or white Christian European Irish people, imagine what they're willing to do to Asians or Africans or Arabs or any other non-white population, because you have this added level of otherness and racism on top of it. And you read Colwell or any of these theoreticians of colonial counterinsurgency, they're very open about it. They're very, very open about it. The only thing these people understand is force. And you can't just you cannot catch the rebels. You have to attack the population among which the rebels hide. So it's, and modern police, I mean, I hate to say this because so much of this counterinsurgency has now become incorporated into police strategies in so-called democracies, whether this one or India or others. So you have what is seen as a situation out of control. And militarized police forces are using doctrines that were essentially developed in counterinsurgency warfare by imperial powers in the 19th century and the early 20th century. Heaven forbid, we're going to have armed troops in most American cities if this guy has his way. And those are the theories that are behind, that are being transmitted from colonial warfare through counterinsurgency to domestic policing, heaven forbid. Anyway, that's another lecture. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for coming to the first session. And please, just a reminder, we have 4 more sessions. We're so lucky to have 4 more sessions. We'll be back next Tuesday. If you haven't registered or you need help getting access to the readings, find a TPF staff and we will help you. But most importantly, before you leave, we want to make a very important announcement. We are coming up on the 2nd annual anniversary, 2 years of the current iteration of the genocide in Gaza. And we will be out on the streets this Saturday at Washington Square Park, 2 p.m., for a protest to demand an immediate end to the genocide, a full arms embargo, all end to U.S. aid to Israel, and a lifting of the siege. So please join us, Washington Square Park, 2 p.m. Bring everyone that you know. It's important we're out in our masses. There's flyers in the back. You can take some to hand them out as well.